full presenter mode?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me minimize that. All right. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. I'm in one of my guest bedrooms at my house, so I've got some children who may scream at random times throughout the whole thing. So I love this topic, right plant, right spot, because I think a lot of our landscape issues that we have come from putting the wrong plant in the wrong spot. So people will ask, well, why do I have to constantly trim this plant? Or why does this plant always succumb to disease whenever it's in a lower spot in the yard? Or why does it always have insect issue? Or why does this plant just not grow in Tennessee? And I'm going to show you examples of all of those. And I think a lot of the issues come from just picking the wrong plant. So I'm even going to talk about the top 5 plants that I get questions on. I've only been an extension agent for about 5 years, but these 5 plants kind of keep reverberating back and forth. So there's kind of a pattern. We've got some plants that are just problematic to disease, some that are just not going to be successful in Tennessee. But I'm a perennial nerd. I'm a plant nerd. That's my daughter, Ellie Pearl, with some of our dailies. We are daily people. But I'm also one who really believes in getting kids outside. If you read research now, the average child today only spends 4 to 6 minutes outside in unstructured playtime. That is appalling, honestly. But that same child spends almost 8 hours a day in front of a screen, iPhone, iPad, television. And that really bothers me. And I think we see a lot of issues with kids because they're just not outside. I know a lot of you probably listening tonight, you grew up outside. I grew up next to a pond. My brother and I were constantly fishing all the time. I'm just going to preach for 1 second. If you've got kids, grandkids, nephews, nieces, or whatever, push them outside. A lot of our issues come from picking the wrong plant and just putting it in the wrong spot. So when Chris asked me to do this, he said, talk about the right plant in the right spot. We've got plants that are just going to be problematic wherever. So we had a new subdivision, and all these pictures in this are either from me or my friends, Dr. Wyndham and Dr. Hale, before they retired. Does anybody know what this plant is? This is horsetail, equisetum, and it can take over an area quickly. We had a new subdivision come into the west side of Lebanon, and they planted this all around the entrance. And after a couple of years, you cannot even tell that monkey grass was in there, because the horsetail took over. We have some plants that are readily available at garden centers. I think of chameleon plant. Y'all think of the old plants, snow on the mountain, agapodium. We have some plants that just take over gardens sometimes, and we don't really mean for them to. This is one of those plants that we probably should only be growing in a concrete pot with no holes in it whatsoever. If you really like it, I know cut flower people really like it, but it's something that will take over really quickly. So before we go to the garden center, we go to the nursery and we see something that's exciting. I think we need to actually research if it's got any type of invasive tendencies to it before it takes over our garden. Because I remember growing up, I grew up in the green industry. I remember selling that old chameleon plant to people at one time. And I know years ago, they regretted after a couple of years, and I didn't really realize that whenever I was a lot younger, how much it would take over someone's yard and garden. But we see new cultivars of things popping out sometimes, and we go to obscure nurseries, and we may see some of the cool things. We think, I think that would be awesome to see. There's a nursery in North Carolina that was selling a variegated kudzu for a few years. I'm a plant nerd, and I love all sorts of plants. And I took this picture in a garden because someone had planted variegated kudzu. I just couldn't imagine planting this in my garden. I think about, maybe a variegated poison ivy or something to go along with it, which we have a nursery in Tennessee selling a variegated poison ivy right now. That's only for the hardcore plant collectors. It's not something that's for me, but if you buy a variegated kudzu, you probably just get what you're asking for. But a lot of the issues some plants do fine in Tennessee if we give them the right growing conditions. We look at this was in downtown Gatlinburg a couple of years ago. These were some arborvitaes, probably green giants. They had to probably shave down that root ball to squeeze it into that little bitty strip between the sidewalk and the driveway, the parking lot right there. There's probably no way this thing was going to be successful long term. And I think we forget about the mature height of how big things are actually going to get in the landscape. It's easy to put something in Google and see, well, how big will a green giant arbor vitae get? Or maybe an emerald arbor vitae, or some of the other ones. It's easy to find that information. I think we need to realize that we need to put them in the right spot so we don't have to constantly cut them, because arbor vitaes are not something that's going to respond well to pruning constantly. And we're going to be talking about pruning here in just a few minutes. Going back to putting the right plant in the right spot, I was at a hotel in Kentucky for a plant conference a couple of years ago, and all around the pool, the landscaper had put all sorts of hosta, and it was directly in full sun. And this was just at the beginning of summer. And if you're a plant nerd and you're watching this thing, you know hostas and full sun do not go well together. And I assume this landscaper, and I like to call people that buy this kind of stuff and put them in those tough situations, land scrapers, because they may have found those they were really cheap at a box store or maybe a nursery, and they thought they'll put them out there and let them go for a couple of years. These land scrapers do some of this stuff. We just need to put the plant in the right spot. Find out if it's a full sun plant, put it in those full sun situations. If we start weakening a plant by giving it wrong growing conditions, that's when it's going to be more susceptible to diseases. That's when it's going to be more susceptible to insects. Mondo grass, poor Mondo grass, kind of prefers some of the shade. It was here in the middle of a parking lot, shaved down. And now, oh, the poor heuchera in the middle of a Walmart parking lot. Now, heuchera, this one was called citronelle. Heuchera is a native plant, one species called villosa, but it's native to damp areas in the woods, kind of along creek beds and areas like that. I can't think of a better place to plant that than the Walmart parking lot in the middle of one of those berms where they have no irrigation and there's concrete surrounding it from all four sides. This was just at the beginning of summer, and you can already see that they're starting to get brown leaves. So when people call sometimes about browning on plants, sometimes it's legitimate diseases, but sometimes it's actually just putting the wrong plant in the wrong growing conditions. Now, Tennessee, for the most part, we're zone 7A. So I know there's a bunch of people on here today. So most of Middle Tennessee is zone 7A. Our average extreme minimum temperature can hit 0 to 5. Now, we're going to be talking about that Arctic blast that we had about a month and a half ago. Our average rainfall generally runs 49 to 52 inches. Now, I think it was 3 years ago, we were topping out at 72 to 75 inches because in February, we ended up with 14 inches. We do have issues with winter kills and diebacks. So after that Arctic freeze, I went out and took this picture of hollies right in front of my office there by the fairgrounds in Lebanon, because every holly around our office, which is a county building, was burnt. And a lot of them completely lost all of their leaves. So we're going to see some plants that have skirted the hardiness zone, zone 7, like this plant on the right, which is called Distilium. So we were kind of touting this as a replacement for laurels. Now, how many of you have laurels that look deader than a doornail right now? We had a landscaper call from Mount Juliet, and I would bet that he's probably planted 1,000 laurels in the last couple of years, and every one of them is brown. And he said, I need to replace them with laurels. And I said, you may have a hard time finding some unless you ship them up from the deep south somewhere. But we're seeing some of the browning on conifers too. So the left plant is a Leland cypress. Sometimes these conifers, we saw some cryptomerias get burnt black. And I don't think they're going to come back. So generally, if it's kind of a broadleaf evergreen like a holly or a Distilium, and I know Evans mentioned a minute ago Nandinas, some of this stuff I think is going to flush back out from the bottom, which means you're going to have to cut out the whole top. You're going to start again with that plant. Conifers, on the other hand, don't regreen up. So when a branch dies, it doesn't just regrow new leaves. It dies completely deader than a doornail. It'll be interesting to see how these Distiliums are working out. So I planted some Distiliums at the fairgrounds I think they were called linebacker, maybe 3 years ago, and they've done pretty well this year. I'm not sure they're going to flush back out or not, but it'll be interesting to see. So the number one thing that we're asking people to do on landscapes is don't prune, because we still have a month of winter to go. We don't want to expose any new fresh wood to more damage in the next month, because February and March can sometimes be finicky. We don't know what we're going to get in terms of rain and snow and everything like that. So don't prune. Wait to see where it reflushes out. So everybody who's called my office in the past month and a half, they said, well, my laurels look bad. I don't know what to do. And I'll say, everybody else in Lebanon is in the same boat. I haven't seen one laurel that looks really good. All the hollies are brown. I think hollies will flush back out just fine. I think I'm just eager to see where they're going to flush back out. Some of this stuff, it's going to take a couple of more months to see where the new growth is actually going to happen. So maybe the first week of May, first week of March, or second week of May, you can go through, see where it's flushing back out, and then cut off all the dead. But this is definitely one that's for the books. This has been an interesting winter so far. We do have some microclimates of plants that did well. So some people will say my laurels did all right. That were spots that were just a few degrees warmer or cooler based upon their proximity. Figs. We have a lot of people with figs in Wilson County, and I think most of those probably got knocked back completely to the ground, and they generally do get knocked back to the ground. The second issue that we see with the right plant in the right place is just the wrong plant for Tennessee in general. I get more calls on Leland cypress than probably any other plant that I'm going to talk about. Number one, Leland cypress are not drought tolerant. Do we ever go through periods of drought in Tennessee where we go more than a week without rain? Of course. I know last fall it was between 6 or 7 weeks we didn't have rain. So Leland cypress generally don't show drought stress until the next spring. So this, Dr. Wyndham actually took this picture. So it was drought stress from the fall, and in the springtime, it was starting to show all this dieback. The problem is there's nothing you can do for this. And I'll talk about each one of these plants more specifically. The other hiccup that we have with Leland cypress is a little fungus called Ceridium canker. So if you're looking at a row of Leland cypress, because we never just see one Leland cypress, we see 50 of them planted in a row. You'll see one that has one brown branch. You go to where that brown branch meets green inside the plant, and you'll see a split in the bark, and sap will be pouring out. It's very common. We get this whenever the plant is stressed out from things like drought stress. And what's the kicker on this Ceridium canker is if one Leland cypress gets it and 50 of them are touching in a row, they're all susceptible to it. And I wish if we were planting screens, we broke up the species, and I'll harp on that here in just a few more minutes. But I think we don't need to plant 50 of the same thing in a row. That's not landscaping. Landscaping is diversity. Landscaping is planting the right plants in the right spot. And I'll talk about some of my favorite plants to use in screens later. But we see newer cultivars of some of these come out, like this was Gold Rider Leland cypress. And I also hear people talk about Murray cypress. They'll say, well, they're better for them. I think they're all pretty much not drought tolerant. We all see issues with them having Ceridium canker. Laurels are in the peach family. So this was some autoleucon laurels and a homeowner. So whenever a homeowner sees this, what's their first notion? They always think something is eating my laurel. So they go get their 7 dust and they spray it. Then they wait a couple of days. They see more holes pop up. They go get more 7 dust. They spray it again. This is not an insect. This is called shot hole. So shot hole is when water stays on the leaf. Shot holes flying through the air, and it lands on that water droplet, and the plant sheds it off naturally. So the plant makes these holes on itself, kind of. It's a neat thing. But what's crazy is it doesn't really kill the plant. It just looks absolutely ugly. So if you really want to knock this thing out, plant something else, or Spray it with a fungicide every 10 days throughout the entire growing season. That may be the best way to kind of knock this out. But it's the easiest way. And I heard one of my professors one time say, the easiest way to identify an auto-leucan laurel in the landscape is look for the holes. And I never really thought about that, but every laurel I see in the summertime has holes throughout their leaves. It looks like someone shot it with buckshot. Laurels are also in the peach family, and if you have ever tried to grow peaches, you know they are very difficult in Tennessee because of all the fungus issues that they have, brown rot, etc. But they also are susceptible, and laurels to peach tree borer. So if you see a brown dead branch, it could be some drought, it could be some waterlogging issues, but it could also be peach tree borer has drilled a small hole in it, laid its eggs in that branch, and killed that branch. I'm getting more and more calls on pin oaks than I've ever seen before because I think they were just so widely planted in subdivisions as just the shade tree for all these landscapes. So bacterial leaf scorch starts off, the bottom branches die. Usually late summer, we see this burning effect. It looks like drought stress on all of the leaves toward the bottom. And within a couple of years, the whole plant dies. So this was a homeowner in Mount Juliet. He had an entire row planted on both sides of his driveway, and I'm going to guess 20 or 25 pin oaks on both sides of the driveway, but every other pin oak was dead. And what's crazy is that every other pin oak was already starting to show signs of this bacterial leaf scorch. The problem with it, it shuts off water flow. Once it gets inside the plant, there's nothing you can do for it. You just kind of have to watch your plants die over a few years. So people will say, what can I do to prevent it? It's spread by a little bug called a leafhopper. It's so hit or miss on whether it's going to affect your plants. So usually once one starts stressing out, usually the other ones are stressing out. Going back, the easiest way to try to prevent this is to plant different species of things. So bacterial leaf scorch not only affects pin oaks, the other plant that I get a lot of questions on are sycamores, but it can affect a whole wide species of things. But I generally just see it on pin oaks and sycamores. Roses have really been getting knocked out over the past 10 years from rosette virus. So rosette virus is spread by a mite called an aerified mite that gets into it, and it kind of chews on the plant and lands on the other one. So it kind of has this witch's broom growth. All the leaves start looking twisted. All the new growth is red, and those stems will have a ton of thorns all over them. So it kind of looks like it's a mutation of the plant. Once it's in the plant, there's nothing you can do because all these, like the bacterial leaf scorch, it's systemic. Once it gets inside, it goes to its whole body. The same thing for rosette virus. Once it gets inside of it, I know I've had landscapers call, I just try to cut it out and then I go from there. That's not how this works. So the issue with this rosette virus is we'll see them planted in like big berms and banks, or maybe at Walmart, they'll have 50 knockout roses planted in one big landscape bed. Well, the middle one dies from rosette virus. So what do? They go through, grab that, shake it real good, shake off all the soil, shake off those mites, and then carry it to their truck, throw it in the back of their truck, replant it with another knockout in that same exact spot. We've got to get away from planting 50 of the same species in the same thing. Now, I still have roses. I like roses. I just don't have 50 roses around. I've got just a couple of roses around my landscape beds. But it affects every rose. So if you're thinking hybrid teas are more resistant, false grandifloras, false floribundas, false drift roses, carpet roses, they're all susceptible to this. So you just kind of have to watch about it and just use them sparingly. There are some great roses on the market. I've got a couple of different ones that I really like. The last plant that I still get questions on, and I question why we still have it for sale in our state, is Bradford pear. A homeowner called and said, Lucas, I want you to come look at my Bradford pear. And I thought, okay, let me go see what it is. And I pulled up to the driveway and I saw this Bradford pear. And I guess the previous homeowner, this homeowner was a new homeowner in the house, and this Bradford pear was right outside their house. And they said, what happened here? I said, the only thing I can assume is the previous homeowner, when that thing split, which all Bradford pears have an expiration date. Okay. When that thing split, he was an old farmer. He ratcheted that thing back together, and that grew into the chain. And this was the coolest picture I've ever taken. But they said, what should we do? I think all Bradford pears should be pruned one time at the ground. Cleveland Select, all these Calorie pears, we see their invasive tendencies they've taken on the side of the interstates. All these white trees that we see popping up everywhere, that's all these Calorie pear seedlings. It's just a headache of a plant. But it was interesting. I was speaking to a small FCE group a couple of years ago on plants that I don't like. And I talked about Bradford pear, and I kept bad mouthing it. And then I said, can you believe this guy in this county put this thing back together, wrapped a chain around it, put it come along, and made that thing grow back together? And this little old lady in the back of the room raised her hand, and she said, that's on Bluebird Lane behind the fairgrounds. I said, yes, it is. She said, my husband did that. And I could have crawled under the podium and died. But we had a good laugh, but I was extremely embarrassed at that point. So I try not, now I know what she looks like. I know not to say that in public as much. Be a smart shopper. If you're going to go get the right plant, make sure you're going to get the right plant and find factual information. And I think the biggest hiccup is a lot of us are gardeners. When we go to the box store, we go to the back of the store and we look for those 50-cent plants that are on their way out. And we think in the back of our head, I can save that. How many of you listening to this have thought, it's only 50 cents. I think I can save this plant and bring it back to life. I like a good challenge as well. But a lot of those plants are discounted because they've either got diseases or they've either got a lot of bugs on them. A lot of these things we don't want to bring to our gardens. So pull it out of the pot. Look at the roots. If the roots are white and healthy, you may be all right. Look under the leaves, look for bugs. If the roots are brown and mushy and they smell funny, leave it there. We see it a lot on conifers. So if you see some browning conifers that may be $1 at the box store, and we think, you know, it's only $1, I'm going to take a chance, take it out of the pot. If the roots just smell rotten and are black, leave it there. It's not going to, you're not going to save it at all, even if it is $1. If you're a hardcore gardener, get this book, Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Michael Durr. Phenomenal book. If you've got any question about any plant, how big it's going to get, how many times the author has killed it, and he's going to tell you where he's seen it and where the biggest one is and all the cultivars that he can find of that exact genus and species. Phenomenal book. Not a single color picture in the entire book, but it doesn't need one. Local nurseries can be good or bad. I get frustrated at nurseries sometimes when I go and I'll see crepe myrtles for sale, and I'll say, what cultivar are they? And they'll say pink. You know how many pink cultivars of crepe myrtles are on the market today? Hundreds of pink crepe myrtles. We don't know how big it's going to get. Find factual information. UT Gardens website, follow their Facebook page. They post a lot of trial information also. So go look and see what's done well in their trials. I know Dr. Bumgarner is doing a lot of vegetable trials. We see a lot of plant picks and a lot of plant trials at the 3 UT gardens in the state also. Go look and see what they've killed and go see what has been successful for them. If you've never been to those gardens, take time out of your day in the summer, go visit those gardens and see what looks good so you can take back those ideas to your house. It's easier to go look and see how it's looking in someone's garden than buying it online and just taking a gamble on whether it looks good or not. I've been that person. I bought stuff maybe that was new in the catalog, and I think, you know, what was it, 20 years ago, these orange and yellow coneflowers were coming out, and I've never really had a whole lot of success out of them. I got so excited about one called tomato soup, and there was one called mac and cheese, and they just did not fare well at my mother's house. Watch for plants that already have diseases. So this was some cankers on some yellow twig dogwoods, and this was from the Soil Plant and Pest Center, Dr. Wyndham, Dr. Hale. who retired in the past year were phenomenal people, and I steal a lot of their pictures. We see some hiccups with some plants that people could still be potentially planting. We can still see ash trees for sale. If you've not heard of the emerald ash borer, you're going to hear about it pretty soon. It may not be in your county yet. It's definitely in most of the counties in Middle Tennessee. So we really don't see ash trees for sale anymore, but I still see some listed in some catalogs and things like that for sale. Even though ash trees are really touted as good trees, it's probably not a good time to plant in an area where you have emerald ash borer. We have one industry that is extremely worried about this bug. What do we make out of ash trees? I think it's the Louisville Slugger baseball bat. Baseball bats, that's a huge industry. We do have some newer bugs and newer diseases kind of popping out. Boxwood blight has not been in Middle Tennessee all that long. So if you're going to the store and you go to the back of the store, you go see their boxwoods are $1 and they've got black lesions on the stem. They've got black holes or black lesions on the stems and the leaves. Leave it there. Could be boxwood blight. Boxwoods can be a little finicky anyways. They suffer from root rot really easily. In the boxwoods in the store, sometimes you may see plants that may have just got some freeze damage on them. So this was an arbor vitae that just had the tips killed back from wintertime. Totally fine. It's going to grow out fine. The whole tree did fine, but it was just the very, very tips, and the homeowner was concerned about that. Learn about some of these new bugs, some of these new pests, some of these new diseases that we actually have coming on the market now. The big one that I see anymore is crepe myrtle bark scale. It's so easy to spot because all the leaves will turn black from sooty mold and all the bark will just be solid white. Spotted lanternfly is not in Middle Tennessee yet, but it's a host plant and it likes every tree, I think, under the sun. It's going to be a big industry. It's going to be a big hurt to the industries in fruit, grapes, and things like that. I already talked about emerald ash borer. I know none of you have stink bugs trying to get in your homes in the wintertime. And I'm going to show you a picture of ambrosia beetle damage here in just a second. So maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we had our first crepe myrtle bark scale scare in Wilson County. First discovered by Chris Cooper in Memphis, and then it just kind of went across our state extremely fast. And I think it's probably just because crepe myrtles are so commonly planted. You go to a subdivision here in Lebanon or Mount Juliet, you're going to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of crepe myrtles, and they're all topped. We'll talk about pruning more here in just a second. These are kind of difficult to get rid of. More than likely, you'll have to use some type of a systemic insecticide, but it's easy. If you were to, do that in April or May, pour it around the base of the plant. To get them off the trunk like this, take a power washer to them and blow them off, and then spray it maybe with some kind of insecticidal oil on the bark. If you really want to see if it is crepe myrtle bark scale, just take a toothpick and poke them. They'll bleed because it's a bug. Ambrosia beetle, a homeowner called. Red maples have had some issues with ambrosia beetles for the past few years. A homeowner called, he planted a red maple. He had mulch piled all the way up to it had to be 1.5 feet or 2 feet up from the ground. So the red maple tree was already stressed because they have shallow roots. We don't need to pile up mulch really high. I don't know if you've heard, if you pile up a bunch of mulch at the base of a tree, what you're doing is composting your tree. Slowly, it starts to die. We rot that bark at the base of the tree and it slowly kills it. This homeowner called and he said, and the mulch probably stressed it out. So ambrosia beetles are usually attracted to stressed out trees. It was green the day before and then it wilted overnight. And we went and looked around it and we found this little bitty hole in the side of it. And that the size of that frass, which is the sawdust, was about the size of a toothpick. It's extremely small. So if a homeowner calls and they say, my red maple tree wilted overnight, I just want you to come look at it. Just look for a couple of really small holes and then look for the frass or the sawdust around the base of it. Usually Once they're in there, there's nothing you can do. I've seen a peach tree come back after being severely infected in a small orchard. But if it was me, I probably would have. It had frass all over it. He wanted to see if he could save his tree, and he did. But I probably would have cut it down and burned it if it was mine. But we've got the mindset sometimes that all bugs are bad. But we don't need to have that mindset because we have a lot of good bugs in the landscape. If you're a vegetable gardener, you 100% know what these eggs are on your squash plant. I bought a new iPhone a couple of years ago, and I was taking cool pictures of all my squash bug eggs. This is squash bug eggs. This is something we don't like. Most people will try to use an insecticide or just take tape and try to get those off or rip them off, but don't have the mindset that all bugs are bad. This guy looks ferocious. If I touch him, he's definitely going to sting me. I don't want to be anywhere near him. I probably should just go ahead and kill this guy. So this is our native passion flower. And this little bug is a Gulf fritillary butterfly. Awesome. Doesn't really bother anything except passion flower, but I've never seen it kill passion flower all the way to the ground. But please don't have the mindset that we need to go through and kill every bug, because we have a lot of bugs doing a lot of good things. We don't realize the benefits of pollinators sometimes. And I do have homeowners call sometimes, and they say, I just want to kill every bug on my property. That's going to be a very limiting factor because most of the bugs on your property are good. If we just target those bugs that are creating issues, that's fine. Now, I am not anti-pesticide. I use pesticides when necessary. I have a huge vegetable garden. I raise a couple of different things that I like to play with. And sometimes I have to use insecticides. Sometimes I have to use fungicides. But I'm making sure that I'm hitting the target. And I got some calls like this in the past couple of weeks. They'll say, I've got holes all through my tree. I need to treat this tree for these bugs. What is this? Most of y'all probably know this. This is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. It's a type of woodpecker drilling those holes horizontally. Really, there's nothing you can do. I've never really seen it kill a tree, but I've seen some trees severely wholly based upon that yellow-bellied sapsucker. And the branch on the right, I thought that picture of lichen on the left was cool in the woods the other day. The branch on the right was left on my desk. This is probably the number one question that extension agents get. This moss is killing my tree. What can I spray to get rid of it? And he'll say, well, this parasite, this moss. I get a lot of questions like that. And that was just sitting on my chair one day. Usually, that is a sign that your tree is stressed out from something else. Look at the base of the tree. Look for little holes. It could have gotten drought stressed. Look to see if you see any mulch piled up on the base of the tree that you've been composting your tree. And usually it's hard to tell someone. It's usually 90% of the trees die in the landscape from the homeowner. And I would say most of the trees that don't have mulch around the base of them are killed by the landscaper or the person mowing their lawns, because they take that weed eater and they girdle all the way around that tree underneath the bark. Just maybe a tenth of an inch is the xylem and the phloem. You cut off the water flow and the food flow enough times, you've killed that tree. It's probably the number one killer of dogwoods in the landscape. It's the number one killer of red maples in the landscape. We just constantly hit the base of that tree. Just quit it. All right. We see a lot of Facebook posts, a lot of social media posts saying, leave your leaves for pollinators. I'm split. If I had diseases in my landscape, I'm going to go through and probably burn a lot of those leaves. If they had diseases from last year, a lot of those diseases are going to overwinter in those old leaves, and you don't want to compost them. You just want to make sure you get rid of them off of your property. I thought this was really awesome. And I may have shown this to some of y'all before. I like antiques. If it's an antique gardening thing, I am all about it. This guy from church gave me a stack of magazines called Me Hands Monthly. And this was a nursery a little over 100 years ago. And a lot of the plants that they were promoting at the time are now like invasive and on the ban list. But if you look at that ad in the back of the December 1902 magazine, it says gardener wanted. I need a thoroughly trained man for my place, which is one of the finest in the country. Must be well posted in all branches. A greenhouse specialist will not answer. Should know something of trees, shrubs, and hardy perennials. Record and habits should be of the best. He should be childless and content to remain so. Do you think an advertisement would fly like that today? I laughed and laughed. I thought that was hilarious. So if you ever see any old gardening magazines, send them my way. Watch for newer diseases. And I've already talked about bacterial leaf scorch on pin oak and sycamore, rose rosette, boxwood blight. And we'll talk about aster yellows here in just a second. And we're getting more and more calls on downy mildew. We have cultivars that are resistant in impatiens. One that I can think of is called Beacon. And Rutgers University has released a ton of cultivars of basil that are resistant to downy mildew. So if you had impatiens that by August, they just had bare stems and all the leaves had fallen off, more than likely it was downy mildew. It just blows up from the south every year. If you see basil and you'll see some kind of gray mottling on the leaves, on the back of the leaves, more than likely it's downy mildew if it's in late summer. You can use a fungicide to prevent a lot of those things, but that's more money for you. It's a lot more work, and I'm just lazy. I don't want to spray that. But the easiest way is just to plant resistant cultivars to begin with. Go get some of these resistant basil. If you like basil that much, get some of the newer downy mildew resistant basil plants. I mentioned aster yellows. I took this picture in our master gardener garden. So aster yellows is spread by leafhoppers primarily. You look at aster yellows and it looks like the bloom has just dropped all of its petals, and you'll see all these little bitty blooms coming out from the side. This will eventually kill the plant, but in this bed where we saw this, there were a ton of other coneflowers. So once we spotted that one had aster yellows, we went through, dug that up, bagged it up, and got it off the property completely. So don't go to the garden center and find this in the back of the garden center for sale for $1 and get it. It's easy to find rose rosette infected plants already in the garden center in the still full price section. It's easy to find probably plants with aster yellows. And I remember seeing Dr. Wyndham post pictures of basil for sale at garden centers that had downy mildew already on it, because a lot of our plants are not grown here. They're shipped up from the south. So really watch for these diseases, even if it's not in the discounted section. Make sure you're looking at all sides of it. Pruning. It's a good idea to put down those pruners after August. But all of these landscapers prune boxwoods generally in October, November. So what happens? We get a warm day in December, those boxwoods start flushing out new growth. Then we get cold, then it all goes brown, and they call me and ask me what it is, and it's usually just winter burn. Determine the correct species for pruning in winter, and we'll talk about hydrangeas in just a second. Please don't top trees. We see that as a common practice, and it should never have been a common practice. Trees don't respond well to it. They don't grow out of it. All right, looking at hydrangeas, we've got some hydrangeas that form their buds on new wood, and some that you can cut back to the ground and they'll flush out and they'll always bloom that year. Generally, the paniculatas and arborescens bloom on new wood, which would be little lime, limelight, phantom, bobo, and the list goes on and on because there's 150 cultivars now. You can cut those things down to 1.5 feet in March, and they'll always bloom that year. The arborescens are the same way, which are kind of the smooth hydrangeas, Annabelle hydrangeas, the big ones. So whenever we get a good rainfall, they're laying in the mud. The hydrangea macrophylla, which are the older ones, like the old blue ones and the old pink ones. A lot of the new ones rebloom on new wood, remontant type. But the old macrophyllas, I think of Nico blue. It formed its buds in the fall time. then it would try to bloom in the springtime. So the hiccup with that, it would just be dead stems looking up in the wintertime, and landscapers would go through and they'll say, my blue hydrangeas have just never, ever bloomed. And I'll say, when are you pruning them? And they'll say, I prune them in late February. Well, you're cutting off all of the flowers on those. So just if you got questions and you don't know what kind of hydrangea you got, my email is at the end of this. Just send me a picture and I'll tell you when you can prune that hydrangea. Winter burn on a boxwood, very common, because we go through and shear all those boxwoods into the shape of a box. They flush out new growth. It turns completely brown. It'll grow out of it. It just looks bad for a few months. So this was a southern magnolia. So a homeowner called about a completely other issue. And as I was pulling in her driveway, I saw this southern magnolia, which is an evergreen magnolia. And I said, what'd you do to your magnolia there? And she said, my landscaper just left. He pruned it for me. I said, can I have a picture of that? She said, yes, you can. She said, he even left a leaf at the top. And you can see one little leaf right there. I wished I could remember where this was in Lebanon, because I would like to go back and see what it looks like. But you can also see kind of at the base where probably the weed eater has hit it a significant number of times. Oh, that poor magnolia. How many of you seen crepe myrtle? They bloom on new wood. So you can go through and cut a crepe myrtle back to the ground and it's always going to bloom. You can always cut them back. But if you really want to have a shorter crepe myrtle, just plant one that stays a lot smaller. Cutting back just ruins the whole sculptural form. So when I think of crepe myrtles, a lot of these newer purple leaf ones, they stay smaller, like 6 to 10 feet tall. I think this one was Midnight Magic I had at a previous home, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. But then I also think about probably the most common color of crepe myrtles that most people want anymore is red. When you look at the mature height on some of these red crepe myrtles, Dynamite is the most commonly planted one all over the place. And it's the one that we cut back. And if you want a red one that's just going to stay a lot smaller, get Red Rooster, 8 to 10 feet. If you want one that's going to be kind of a medium-sized red crepe myrtle, get Red Rocket. But I like Dynamite, but just if you're going to plant Dynamite and then put it right next to your house, which is what most landscapers do, you're going to have to cut it constantly. Why would we put plants next to our house that we're going to have to constantly cut? If we put the right plant in the right spot, I don't think ideally we need to have to prune it a whole lot. Now think about that magnolia tree in that previous picture a few slides ago. That magnolia tree is fine right there. I'm not sure even what the purpose of cutting that. She had a big open area for that. I'm not sure what the purpose of that landscaper pruning that thing back to that size, but I see a lot of southern magnolias, and I'm sure some of y'all have too, planted directly next to the foundation of a building, maybe a giant hospital, and they want that magnolia to kind of, crawl up the side of that building. Insane. You're going to have to cut it constantly. I have a lot of plants around my property. I don't want to have to prune something all the time. I'm lazy. These poor gray owl junipers. This was at maybe a gas station or something like that a couple of weeks ago. They went through and they've got this boxwood syndrome that every plant needs to be cut like a boxwood. Gray owl junipers, if you leave them alone, they get pretty large, even though the tag says 3 to 4 feet tall. Yeah, you can keep them 3 to 4 feet tall. But if you were going to plant a gray owl juniper, give it plenty of space because it's a really nice looking plant. And I'm not even sure. This was at Lowe's. They just went through and kind of topped all the end of the branches. Sad. All the roses kind of shaped into that lovely boxwood shape. All the holly shaped into it. We've got a lot of great hollies that stay really short also. And I'm going to guess, because I don't know what the cultivars these were, but I'm going to guess that these are some type of a dwarf Burford holly, which normally gets pretty large. And hollies are really good, though, that you can cut a holly back to the ground and it's going to flush back out every time. But that stump is going to get bigger and get bigger and get bigger. putting the right plant in the right spot. We need to make sure that we're putting it properly into the ground. At one of our larger banks in town, they had a beautiful row of red maple trees. Well, inevitably, the middle one dies, and they called the landscaper, and the landscaper called me, and they said, we've got to know why this red maple tree died. They left the leather straps around the base of it, and it just girdled it, which is pretty common. Cut those nylon straps off, cut the leather straps off, get them off, let that plant breathe. I'm not opposed to, bald and burlap trees, bigger the better. If you can maintain it, that's fine. Most trees don't need to be staked. This was some small purple leaf cherries at a woman's up and down her driveway, and I bet they were no taller than 5 or 6 feet tall. And she had those things strapped with 3 or 4 straps around each side. And I said, she called me about maybe a lawn issue. And I said, what you got those trees strapped for? She said, well, I was afraid they would fall over. I said, have they ever fallen over? And she said, I don't think so. I said, I would cut them all off because I think they were from big plastic, tubs. Those are not probably going to fall over unless we have constant amount of winds. But if you feel the need to stake something, it's got to be loose. It can't be strapped on there so tight that you can play music off of those nylon strings. Make sure you're digging your hole properly. This is my daughter. That's my friend Jason Reeves. That's my wife. Make sure you're digging the hole big enough. Make sure you're planting it at the right depth in the hole. A lot of the issues that we see, people planting the trees either too deep or they're planting them way too shallow because maybe they think, and I saw a landscaper one time going through and he was planting plants, and one Leland cypress was really tall above the ground. And I thought, why did he do that? And we realized that there was a giant rock there, and he just still put it on top of the rock, chiseled out a little spot and put it on top of the rock. Not going to be successful. Make sure you're digging the hole properly. Make sure you're planting it at the right depth. Some of these trees are grafted or they're chip budded. Make sure you're planting that above the ground and you're not burying it below the ground. Ideally, it's probably a good practice to not fertilize the first year. I think we need to let plants get acclimated to the soil that's already there. I'm a fan of putting the backfill of whatever trashy soil you already have back into it and not amending it, because it'll kind of make a beautiful pot of soil and those roots won't go out. And you say, well, Lucas, I've got clay. Well, so does every other Tennessean. And if you really test clay in a soil test, it's really high in phosphorus, it's really high in potassium. Clay holds on to all of that stuff. The biggest hiccup that we have with it is it holds on to too much water sometimes. But don't have it as a complete circle. Go through and chisel those sides. Don't put plastic around the plant's base. The first house that my wife and I bought, maybe 10 years ago, all the landscape had thick sheets of plastic under it. It took me a week because they put mulch, and all that mulch breaks down on top of that plastic, makes a fantastic place for weeds to grow on top of the plastic. And it took me a week to get all that plastic out of it. Landscape fabric doesn't work. Watch the water about once a week, an inch. Try not to water it every day, and the plants will kind of tell you when they need water. Don't weed eat them to death. Wounds can attract borers and other insects. So when we think about that ambrosia beetle, it's usually attracted to plants that are stressed out. We don't want to give them another reason to come to our property. Screen plantings. Avoid planting all the same species in a row. Leland cypress, 50 of them in a row. When one gets Ceridium canker, they're all going to get it. Plant a mixed screen. Here's some of my favorite ones that we use. Southern magnolias. And people will say, well, they're not fast enough. Well, the faster something grows, the faster it's going to die. If it grows a lot slower, it's probably going to be a lot stouter and going to be there a lot longer than some of these really quick evergreens that we're growing. Southern magnolia, great cultivars if you want something smaller like teddy bear, Southern charm, little Jim. Red cedar, arbor vitae works fine in a mixed screen. I don't like seeing 50 arbor vitaes in a row because inevitably every other one's going to die. I love hollies, and we've got beautiful yellow and orange berried hollies. If you're on Facebook, let me encourage you to follow the American Holly Society on Facebook. Phenomenal information. I like Arizona cypress. I like junipers. Mix it up. Other possible causes of plant death we see sometimes, people will call and they'll say, I thought I did everything right. I put the right plant in the right spot. Well, they burned it up with too much fertilizer. I remember a homeowner growing up put about 25 pounds of 6-12-12 garden fertilizer around a tree one time to try to make it grow. 25 pounds. You heard me right. Herbicide, now 25 pounds of 6-12-12 is like $1,000 now at the co-op. Herbicide use, I had a homeowner call last year. He planted all sorts of various oaks on his property. The next week, his lawn company came in and did a weed treatment of his lawn. Every oak had cupped up leaves. And he said, what has happened? And I said, this is caused by one of those weed killers, what they use. And I said, what did they spray? He said, I don't know what they sprayed. They just told me they were going to use weed killer. If you've got somebody doing your landscape for you and they're spraying something, you need to know what they're spraying on your property and making sure that it's not actually spraying up on the leaves. Now that one, I assume he just kind of hit it. I assume the guy was just maybe doing it on a really windy day. Building on the site, I see it in subdivisions all the time. They'll try to leave one spindly tree in the middle of this subdivision that'll have no branches up the first 80 feet. They'll have 5 or 6 little branches at the top. They'll drive bulldozers all around it. They'll drive trucks all around the base of it, compact all those roots. That tree does not have a chance to live. Most of those trees generally die over the long run. Changes in drainage, and then we see issues with people piling up soil over the roots, and it kind of suffocates the roots. We have some trees that are just going to have shallow roots. Maples. Plant species is a major clue for issues. People will call and they'll say, my cherry is dying, and I'll say it's probably this. The number one question that I still get on some of these conifers, and they'll say, I wished I could grow a Colorado blue spruce here in Tennessee. I've tried 5 different times. And I'll say, where do you think the best place to plant a Colorado blue spruce is? Colorado. The same case. So a landscaper convinced a homeowner, this lady, I told her some plants to plant around her beds. I said, here's what I would plant here and here and here. She went to her landscaper in her nursery, and they sold her a ton of Alberta spruces. Alberta spruce is native to Canada. It does best in Canada, does not do great in Tennessee. Hellerii, Japanese hollies, we see a lot of root rot with them. Boxwoods and yews get root rot issues. Azaleas, pH issues. That's usually the issue we see. Dogwoods, boars, and I think the number one killer of dogwoods are people planting them in areas where they're not happy and then hitting the base of the tree. Lilacs, oh, I wish I could be successful with a lilac. Powdery mildew and other fungi. This is my contact name, my email, my phone number. I'm easiest if you've got a picture you want to send with a disease or something like that. Just email it to me, and then I will try to get you an answer to it. If I don't know, we've got some other people who can help out. But you can have my email, my phone number. It's good to reach out to your extension agent too. I think I am done.